The banquet hall of Castle Vorn had never felt so cold. June noticed it before she even crossed the dark stone archway, before she saw the torches trembling along the walls as though they knew something was wrong. The smell was the first sign: burning resin, spilled wine, and beneath all of it, something sharp and tense that she had learned to recognize since childhood. It was the scent of wolves pretending not to be afraid. She tightened her grip on the serving tray and walked in. The heir presentation banquet happened once per generation. Every noble house of the tributary packs attended. Every hierarchy of every clan redistributed itself around a single table, and the Alpha King's son was shown to the world for the first time outside the inner chambers. It was a night of power, a night when wolves measured each other with their eyes and their noses, deciding who rose and who fell within the order. June neither rose nor fell. June served. She was 23 years old and held the position of head attendant of the East Wing, a title that sounded more significant than it was. In practice, it meant she stood for 12 hours at a stretch, refilled goblets, avoided the gaze of nobles, and learned to make herself invisible inside her own body. She was good at it. She'd had years of practice. "You're 2 minutes late," Petra murmured beside her, lifting half the tray's load without being asked. Petra had dark hair cut close to her jaw, and the habit of appearing exactly when needed, as though she could smell other people's stress. They had grown up together in the servants' quarters, daughters of packless wolves, no rank, no name that mattered. "Lord Aldrich has asked for wine twice already." "Lord Aldrich can wait 2 more times," June replied under her breath, eyes already mapping the room. Petra swallowed a smile. The hall was full. Banners from 7 different packs hung from the dark timber beams, red and gray of the Vorn, forest green of the Heron, black and gold of the Cassin, others June recognized by shape, but had never needed to know closely. The tables formed a horseshoe around an open central space, where a low platform held the Alpha King's primary chair. Darius Vorn was not sitting in it. He stood beside it, speaking in low tones with 2 men June identified as generals by the cut of their armor. He was taller than most in the room, not in a showy way, but in the way a stone is larger than the grass around it. It was simply a difference in substance. Dark hair, a controlled expression, and that particular silence that surrounded powerful alphas without effort. The kind of silence that said, "This one does not need to raise his voice to be obeyed." June looked away. It was none of her concern. She began her circuit, serving, collecting, smiling when required, and disappearing when possible. The evening followed its usual ritual: speeches, toasts, the careful exhibitionism of nobles who despised each other but understood the necessity of the arrangement. June caught fragments as she moved. "They say the boy already feels the bond, born with a strong scent. Aldrich is pushing for a marriage alliance before the first frost. The Heron brought 80 wolves. 80. That's not a visit. That's a statement." June collected an empty goblet near the central pillar and drew a slow breath. The air was thick with layered scents. So many wolves in an enclosed space created an invisible haze that left her faintly lightheaded. She was not a pack wolf. She had never completed any integration ritual. Her scent was too clean, too neutral. What the nobles called empty and the other servants called lucky, because an empty scent threatened no one. She was turning back toward the kitchen corridor when she heard the crying, faint, too high to come from the main hall. It came from one of the side passages connecting the West Wing, the private chambers, to the service area. June stopped. Petra, across the hall, hadn't heard it. No one had. The musicians covered everything. She went anyway. The corridor was poorly lit, a single torch every 10 paces, long shadows filling the gaps between them. The crying grew clearer as she moved. It was a very small child, the kind of sound that hasn't learned control yet, that doesn't know there's any reason to be quiet. And beneath the crying, something else. Footsteps. Several. Too heavy for servants. June turned the corridor's bend and saw 3 wolves. They wore none of the tributary pack uniforms. Their clothes were dark, unmarked, the kind of thing worn by people who don't want to be remembered. One of them was holding the boy, the Alpha King's son, a child not yet 2 years old, eyes wet, Small fists clenched, fighting without knowing yet what fighting was. All three men looked at her. June did not think. She was not a hero in that moment. She was simply someone whose body moved before her mind could stop it. She threw the tray at the face of the man holding the child, metal connecting with the bridge of his nose with a sharp crack, and the boy pitched forward. June caught him before he reached the floor, turned, and ran. She didn't get far. The first blow came to her back, a pain that wasn't immediate, that arrived with a second's delay the way thunder follows lightning. She staggered, but didn't fall. She held the child tighter. She tucked her elbow around his head and kept moving. The second blow came to her left side. The third, when she tried to shout, landed between her ribs with a precision that suggested training, not anger. She opened her mouth anyway. The sound that came out was not a clean shout. It was something animal, torn. The kind of thing that travels through walls and timber, and the noise of 50 wolves drinking wine and pretending to be civilized. The fourth blow came, as she was already going down, knees on stone, arms still locked around the child who was crying and twisting without understanding. June felt the cold of the corridor floor rising through her body, as though the stone were slowly absorbing her. She pressed her back against the wall and placed the boy between her arms and her chest, curled over him. The fifth blow never finished. There was a roar. Not the kind wolves produce in training, not the performative sound of ritual challenges. It was the kind of roar that exists before language, before hierarchy, before anything wolves had built to pretend they were more than beasts. It was the sound of something that had never needed to learn authority, because it was born made of it. June heard the sound of 3 men being removed from the corridor, not gently. Then different footsteps, calmer, but heavier. She couldn't lift her head. The boy had stopped crying, or perhaps she had stopped hearing. She couldn't separate things properly anymore. There was blood on the stone floor, and she noted with a strange detachment that it was hers. "Release the boy," said a voice above her. "No." The word left her before she thought it. "Not until... I am his father." June looked up. Darius Vorn was crouched in front of her. Up close, he was different from how he appeared across the banquet hall. No less imposing, he remained that, but more real. There was something in his eyes she hadn't expected to find in a man who commanded 8 packs and had never needed to ask for anything. There was urgency. "Let me take him," he said. His voice dropped so low it was barely voice anymore, just texture and weight. "You can let go. He's safe now." June opened her arms. Darius gathered the child with a speed that only belonged to fathers, not to kings. He checked the boy with his fingers, neck, pulse, breathing. And something in the tension across his shoulders came undone when he confirmed the child was whole. Then he looked at her again. June had her back against the wall, both palms flat on the floor, and 5 places on her body that had begun to hurt in different and competing ways. She tried to stand, and couldn't complete the motion. "Don't move," he said. "I need to return to service," she said. "I'm already behind." He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "What is your name?" "June." She breathed carefully, testing how much air her lungs would accept without complaint. "East Wing attendant." Darius said nothing more. He called the guards who had arrived behind him with a single gesture, and June had the strange impression that he was having difficulty pulling his eyes away from her while he gave the orders. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the boy's face looking back at her over his father's shoulder, those wide, wet eyes that understood nothing, but kept watching, as if they already knew, with the animal certainty that very small children sometimes carry, that she mattered. June did not wake in the servants' quarters. She woke in a bed she had never seen before, under linens that smelled of cedar wood and healing herbs, and the ceiling above her was carved stone, worked in a pattern she recognized from the inner chambers of the castle, rooms she had never been permitted to enter. It was morning. Light came in at an angle through a narrow window. And from the other side of the closed door, she could hear voices. Many voices. June sat up slowly. The movement cost her more than she expected. Pain spread across her ribs in a slow, deliberate wave, the kind that doesn't peak. It simply establishes itself and stays, like a tenant who knows they have the right to be there. She pressed one hand to her side and took inventory. 5 points of damage, each with its own particular complaint. The worst was the one between the ribs. The others were manageable, if she didn't think about them too carefully. She looked down at herself. Someone had changed her clothes. She was wearing a plain linen shirt, clean and loose. Nothing like the servant's uniform she'd had on the night before. Her hands had been wrapped at the knuckles. She didn't remember hitting anything, but apparently she had. The voices outside the door were still there. June swung her legs over the edge of the bed and waited for the room to decide whether it was going to tilt or stay still. It stayed still. She counted that as a victory and stood. The window was narrow but tall, and when she reached it, the view stopped her. The inner courtyard of Castle Vorn stretched below, a wide space of dark stone and morning mist, the kind of quiet that existed in large places before the day's business began. But it was not empty. Along the far wall, standing in a loose formation that was not quite military, but carried the discipline of men who had spent their lives in service to a pack, were wolves. She counted without meaning to. It was a habit from years of managing supply inventories, of knowing at a glance how many goblets were on a table and how many were missing. 20. 20 wolves standing in the courtyard of the inner keep in the early gray light, without explanation. A knock at the door. "Come in," she said, because saying nothing felt worse. The woman who entered was not a servant. Her posture said that immediately. Straight spine, unhurried movement, the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly where you stood in a room's hierarchy and being comfortable with it. She was perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair, and the faint amber shift in her eyes that marked a wolf who had spent decades keeping her nature carefully in check. "You're awake," the woman said, not surprised. More like confirming something she had already expected. "Apparently," June said. "Where am I?" "Guest chambers, East Tower, 3rd level." The woman set a tray on the small table near the window. Broth, bread, a cup of something that steamed. "My name is Marin. I serve as the castle's head of household. The Alpha King asked me to attend to you personally." June looked at her. The Alpha King asked. "He did." June sat back down on the edge of the bed, less because she wanted to, and more because standing while processing that information seemed unnecessarily ambitious. "How is the boy?" Marin's expression shifted slightly. Something that might have been approval, if approval looked like a very small adjustment at the corner of the mouth. "Unharmed. Thanks to you." "He was frightened," June said. "He was more frightened than hurt, but that matters too." "It does," Marin agreed. And this time the approval was less subtle. She moved to the window, looked down at the courtyard, and clasped her hands in front of her with the composure of someone about to say something that required a certain amount of careful framing. "Are you aware of what is happening in the courtyard?" "I can see 20 wolves standing in the cold," June said. "I don't know why." "They arrived at dawn." Marin paused. "Separately, from different packs, different ranks. They don't all know each other." Another pause, shorter. "They came for you." The silence in the room took on a different quality. "That doesn't make sense," June said. "No," Marin agreed calmly. "It doesn't follow any protocol I have seen in 30 years of service to this house, and yet there they are." She turned from the window. "Word travels fast in a castle full of wolves, June. What happened in that corridor last night? The servants know, the guards know, and by extension, every pack representative still within these walls knows. 20 wolves standing in the courtyard asking to formally present themselves to the woman who took 5 blades protecting the Alpha King's heir is, in the language of pack wolves, not a small thing." June stared at her. "I'm a servant." "You were a servant," Marin said simply, not unkindly. Just as a statement of fact, the way one might note that a door that had been closed was now open. Before June could answer that, the door opened again. Not with a knock this time. Petra came through it like she had been held back by something, and had recently decided to stop allowing that. Her eyes went to June, did a rapid full-body assessment, and then visibly exhaled. "You're sitting up. Good. You have color. Also good." She crossed the room and sat beside June on the bed without being invited. which was exactly what June would have expected from her. "How bad is it?" "Manageable," June said. "You have 5 stab wounds. I'm aware. From trained wolves. Also aware." Petra looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression she had been deploying since they were children. The one that said she had many things to say and was deciding which order to say them in. Then she said, "There's a lord standing in the courtyard who introduced himself to the gate guard as Cassin's second son. He apparently walked through the night from the Cassin estate to be here by dawn. She let that land. For you, June." "I heard there are 20 of them," June said. 22 now. 2 more arrived while I was coming up the stairs." Petra's voice was steady, but June knew her well enough to hear the thing underneath it. Not fear, not quite excitement, but something that lived between those 2 places. One of the gate wolves said they're not here by anyone's command. No one called them. No one organized this. They just came. Morin had moved to stand near the door, giving them space with the practiced discretion of someone who understood that some conversations needed a witness, but not a participant. June stood again. The pain reminded her it existed, and she acknowledged it and set it aside. She moved to the window and looked down at the courtyard. 22 wolves. Some in the colors of their packs, some in plain traveling clothes, some bearing the particular stillness of men who had walked a long way through cold pre-dawn air and were not going to let that show in their posture. They were not performing. That was the thing she noticed most clearly. There was no display in how they stood, no calculation. They were simply there. One of them looked up. She didn't know which pack he belonged to. He was broad-shouldered, younger than she expected, with a scar along his jaw and the careful eyes of a wolf who had seen the kind of things that left marks. When his gaze found her at the window, he didn't look away. He held her eyes for a moment, then lowered his head. Not a bow. Something quieter than that. June stepped back from the window. "I need to speak with the Alpha King," she said. Morin's expression shifted again. "He has requested the same." Of course he had. Morin led her through corridors that June had cleaned but never truly seen. The inner passages of the castle's upper levels, where the stone was finer, the carvings more deliberate, where every architectural choice had been made by someone who intended to be remembered. June walked carefully, breathing at a pace that kept the pain in the ribs from escalating, and tried to arrange her thoughts into something that resembled order. She had no idea what she was going to say to the Alpha King. The chamber Marin brought her to was not the throne room. It was smaller. A working room, June thought, the kind of space where decisions were made before they were announced publicly. A long table occupied the center, covered in maps and correspondence. 2 guards flanked the far door. A fire burned low in the hearth on the left wall. Darius Vorn stood at the window with his back to her. He turned when she entered. In the daylight, stripped of the ceremony and the crisis of the night before, he looked different again. Not softer. That was not the right word for him and probably never would be, but more deliberate. Like everything about him had been arranged by some interior principle of economy. No excess. No performance. Just a man who had made a great many decisions in his life and carried each one somewhere in the line of his jaw. His eyes went to her side instinctively, checking the injury, before they came up to her face. "You should be resting," he said. "You requested to see me," she said. Something moved across his expression. Not quite amusement. Something adjacent to it. "I did." He moved away from the window, not toward her, just shifting the weight of his presence in the room. "Sit down, June. I'm fine standing. You're holding your breath every 4th step to manage the pain in your left side," he said. "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, which she suspected was not coincidental. But he didn't use the height to loom, which told her something about him. He moved to the table, rested one hand on its surface, and looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided in advance that this conversation would not involve any of the usual formalities. "Tell me what you saw in that corridor," he said. "Everything. From the beginning." So she told him. She kept it clean and factual, the way she had learned to report shortages in the supply inventory. No editorializing, no emotion, just sequence and detail, the sound she'd heard, the 3 men, the boy, what she'd done, and in what order. She watched his face while she spoke, and found very little there to read, which she understood was its own kind of information. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "No." "Why?" June considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Because he was small and frightened, and there was no one else in that corridor," she said. That's all it was. Darius looked at her for a long time after that. Outside, in the courtyard below the window, she could hear the faint sound of more wolves arriving. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was the thing June noticed most. The way Darius Vorn occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone who was not merely listening to what had been said, but cataloging everything that hadn't been. She was starting to find it difficult to hold his gaze without her pulse doing something she preferred not to examine. "The 3 men have been identified," he said finally. "They were hired. Not by any pack represented at last night's banquet, or so the interrogations suggest. We are still tracing the source." He paused. "That is not why I asked you here." "Then why?" she said. "Because 24 wolves are standing in my courtyard," he said. "And by mid-morning it will likely be more, and every one of them came because of you. And I need to understand what I am dealing with before I decide how to handle it." June straightened in the chair, ignoring the protest from her ribs. "I don't know why they came. I didn't ask them to." "I know you didn't," he said, without any suggestion that he had suspected otherwise. "That's part of what makes it significant." He moved to the chair across from her and sat, forearms on his knees, reducing the formality of the room by several degrees, simply by choosing not to stand above her. "Do you know what it means, in pack law, when wolves present themselves uninvited to a person who has defended an alpha's bloodline?" She didn't. She knew enough pack law to navigate the servant hierarchies and avoid the most serious infractions. The deeper traditions, the ones written in the old language and recited at rituals she was never included in, those had never been her territory. "It means," he said, watching her, "that they are declaring a debt. Pack wolves understand protection as a fundamental currency. What you did last night was not registered by those men out there as an act of service or employment. It was registered as the act of a wolf who chose to place herself between a threat and an alpha's heir with no obligation to do so. In pack understanding, that creates a bond of honor. They came to acknowledge it." June was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a pack wolf," she said. "No," he agreed. "Which makes what you did more significant, not less. A pack wolf acting in defense of the heir fulfills an existing oath. You fulfilled nothing. You chose." The word landed in the room with more weight than its single syllable should have carried. June looked at her wrapped hands. "What happens now?" "That," Darius said, "depends on several things." He leaned back slightly. "The men outside are waiting to be received." In the old tradition, when wolves present themselves to honor a defender, the defender has the right to acknowledge them and accept the declaration, or to decline it and dissolve the bond. If you accept, you become, in the eyes of pack law, a protected figure, not a servant, not a packless wolf, something with standing. "And if I decline, they go home," he said. "The honor is still yours, but the formal standing disappears." June thought about Petra, about the servants' quarters where she had slept for 23 years on a narrow bed with a window that let in the winter, about the word empty, which was what the nobles called her scent, and the careful invisibility she had cultivated so long it had started to feel like a personality trait, rather than a survival strategy. "You said it depends on several things," she said. "What are the other things?" Darius looked at her for a moment that had an edge to it she couldn't fully identify. "There is the matter of my son," he said. She waited. "He hasn't spoken since last night," Darius said. "He's not hurt. The healers have confirmed it. He simply stopped talking." He was beginning to use words, small ones, 4 or 5 that he had learned in the last month. Since last night, he has said none of them. He paused. Except one. June felt something shift in her chest. He has said your name, Darius said quietly. June. Repeatedly. Since this morning, when he woke and you were not in the room. He held her gaze. He is 2 years old and he does not know your name. He heard it once, in a corridor, in a moment of crisis. And it is the only word he will say. The room was very still. Children that age form attachments quickly, June said, because she needed to say something practical, or the pressure behind her sternum was going to become a problem. They do, he agreed. But my son is also the heir to 8 packs, and whatever bond he has decided to form with you is not something I am in the position to dismiss as simple attachment. He stood, slowly, and moved back toward the window. I am not asking you to become his caretaker. I am telling you what is happening so that you have the full information before you make your decision about the courtyard. June stood as well, because sitting while he stood had started to feel like a concession she hadn't agreed to make. Outside the window, the courtyard had grown louder. She could hear the low register of wolves talking in the particular way of men who were waiting patiently but not passively. I want to see them, she said. Darius turned from the window. Now? Yes. He studied her for a moment, the careful, unhurried assessment she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things he considered worth looking at. Then he moved toward the door and held it open. The walk to the courtyard took them through the main corridor of the keep's ground level, past guards who stood straighter as Darius passed, and who looked at June with expressions she couldn't entirely read. Not hostility. Not quite. More like recalibration, like men who had filed her in one category for years and were now being asked to consider a different one. Petra was waiting near the base of the stairs. Her eyes went to June first, then to the Alpha King walking beside her, and her expression performed a rapid and involuntary series of adjustments before settling into something that looked like carefully managed composure. June gave her a look that meant, I will explain later. Petra gave her a look back that meant, you will explain now, or I will invent the explanation myself, and it will be worse. The courtyard doors opened. The morning light had strengthened while she was inside, the mist burning off to reveal a sky the color of pale iron. The wolves in the courtyard turned when she appeared, and the shift was immediate, not dramatic, not choreographed, but the kind of organic reorientation that happened when a room's center of gravity changed. There were 31 of them now. She counted without thinking. They were not uniform in rank or age or pack allegiance. She could see that in the variation of colors, the different styles of cloak and armor, the spread of ages from men who looked barely older than her, to wolves with gray at their temples who carried the kind of stillness that only came from decades of surviving things. What they had in common was the quality of their attention, all of it directed at her with the same unperforming steadiness she had noticed from the window. The one with the scarred jaw was near the front. Up close he was younger than she had thought. Perhaps 26, with the careful posture of a second son who had spent his life proving something. He stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, and inclined his head. My name is Rowan Casson, he said. Second of the Casson line. I walked through the night to be here because what you did deserved to be acknowledged before the day was old. He paused, and the formality in his voice was real, but not stiff. We don't know you. Most of us have never seen your face before this morning, but we know what you did, and we know what it cost you, and in the old language that is enough. A low sound moved through the gathered wolves. Not words. Something older than words, the kind of resonance that pack animals produced when something was confirmed rather than stated. June stood in the cold morning air with 5 healing wounds and borrowed clothes, and the Alpha King standing 2 steps behind her, and she felt, for the first time in her life, the strange and unsteady sensation of being seen, not evaluated, not assessed for usefulness or rank or the emptiness of her scent. Seen. She drew a breath and let it out slowly. I didn't do it for acknowledgement, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I did it because there was a child in that corridor and someone had to. She looked at Rowan Casson, then let her eyes move across the gathered faces. But I hear you, and I won't pretend it means nothing. The sound moved through the courtyard again, deeper this time. From behind her, she heard a small voice. She turned. A castle attendant had appeared in the doorway, a young woman June recognized from the inner chamber staff, holding a small boy against her hip with the careful tension of someone carrying something irreplaceable. The boy had dark hair and his father's eyes, and he was looking at June with the focused intensity of a child who has decided something and is waiting for the world to confirm it. "June," he said clearly. The courtyard went very quiet. Darius had gone still beside her in the particular way of a man who was feeling something he hadn't allocated space for and was deciding what to do about it. June crossed to the boy before she thought about it. She stopped in front of him and crouched down to his level, wincing at the pull in her side, and looked at him carefully. He reached out one small hand and placed it flat against her cheek, with the grave deliberateness of a child performing an action of great importance. "I'm here," she said quietly. He nodded, as if that was exactly what he had needed confirmed, and leaned his head against her shoulder. Behind her, 31 wolves stood in the cold morning air and did not make a sound. The boy's name was Eli. June learned this from Marin, who told her with the particular tone of someone conveying information they considered self-evident, but had accepted was not. Eli Vorn, heir to the 8 Packs, 17 months old, currently refusing to be held by anyone who was not June or his father, and expressing this preference with the absolute clarity available only to very small children who have not yet learned that preferences are negotiable. She learned his name while he was asleep against her shoulder. She was sitting in the small anteroom off the inner corridor. Eli's weight settled into the curve of her arm with the boneless trust of a sleeping child, and Marin was across from her with the expression of a woman who had witnessed many things in 30 years of castle service and was recalibrating her framework for the current situation. "You don't have to hold him," Marin said. "If it's causing pain, it's fine," June said. It was not entirely fine. The position required her left arm to stay slightly elevated, which communicated its displeasure through the wound in her side in regular intervals. She held Eli anyway. There was something about the weight of him. The simple, uncomplicated fact of a small creature that had decided she was safe, that made the pain feel like a minor consideration. Petra arrived with food that June hadn't asked for, and sat beside her with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that if they couldn't control events, they would at minimum control the nutritional intake of the people involved in them. "Eat," Petra said. June ate. "The wolves in the courtyard," Petra said, her voice carefully level. 6 more arrived after you came back inside. 37 total now. The gate wolves stopped counting out loud because it was making them anxious. "What are they doing?" "Standing," Petra said. "Waiting." One of them started a fire near the east wall for warmth, and 3 others moved to it immediately, which apparently means something in pack etiquette, because the Cassin boy looked like he was going to say something, and then didn't. She paused. 2 of the Alpha King's senior wolves went out to speak with them an hour ago. The conversation lasted a long time. June looked down at Eli's sleeping face. He had one fist loosely closed against his own cheek, brows slightly furrowed even in sleep. The expression of a child working something out in a dream. "Petra," she said. "Yes." "What do you think is happening?" Petra was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that June looked up. Petra was looking at her with an expression she had only seen a few times in their lives together. At the river, the winter June turned 14 and fell through the ice. At the eastern gate, the night the Heron wolves passed through, and one of them grabbed June's wrist, and Petra had put herself between them without hesitating. The expression of someone confronting the distance between what they had expected their life to contain and what it was apparently going to contain instead. "I think," Petra said carefully, "that you walked into a corridor last night as a servant and you are not going to walk back out of this castle as one." June didn't answer. Eli shifted against her shoulder and resettled, exhaling a small sound. The door opened. Darius entered without announcement, which June was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through spaces he owned. Not arrogantly, but with the complete absence of the self-consciousness that made other people knock on their own doors. He looked at Eli first, confirming with the automatic efficiency of a father, then looked at June. His eyes stayed on her face for a moment longer than the check-in required. "He's been asleep for an hour," June said. "I know. Marin told me." He moved into the room and took the chair that Marin quietly vacated, a small choreography of hierarchy that happened without anyone acknowledging it. "How is the pain?" "Manageable. You said that before. It was true before and it's true now." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, the outline of what a smile would look like on a face that didn't deploy them carelessly. "The healers want to look at you again this afternoon." "I'll go when he wakes up," she said. Darius looked at his son, then back at her. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and June recognized the posture from the working room that morning, the deliberate reduction of ceremony, the choice to make the conversation between two people rather than between an alpha king and a woman who had no formal standing in his world. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About last night, and about what the interrogation of those 3 men has produced." June waited. "They were not simply hired to take the boy," he said. "They were hired to take him alive and deliver him to a location outside the castle's territory. This was not an assassination, it was an extraction." He paused. "The man who ordered it has not yet been identified. But the method, the timing, the knowledge of the inner corridor layout, all of it points to someone who has been inside these walls, someone who knows the castle's rhythms well enough to know that corridor would be empty during the banquet." The implication settled over June slowly. "Someone who was at the banquet," she said. "Or someone who serves it," he said. "Yes." The room held that for a moment. "You're not suggesting," June said. "No," he said immediately. "I am not." His voice was flat and certain in a way that didn't allow for revision. "What I am telling you is that the investigation is ongoing, and the castle is not entirely safe, which means that the 39 wolves currently in my courtyard are not, from a purely practical standpoint, an unwelcome development." June looked at him. 39 now? "As of 20 minutes ago," he said. And there was something in his voice she was learning to identify, a dryness, very controlled, that lived in the same neighborhood as humor without committing to the address. She looked down at Eli again, at the small fist against his cheek. "What do you want from me?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Darius was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was watching her with that careful, unhurried attention, and for the first time she noticed what it actually felt like to be on the receiving end of it, not evaluated, as she had thought in the working room, not assessed. It was something different. It was the attention of someone who had decided that a thing was worth understanding completely, and had the patience to do it properly. "I want," he said slowly, "to offer you a formal position in this household, not as a servant, as a ward of the Vorn line with the standing that entails." He paused. "It would mean protection under pack law. It would mean the wolves in the courtyard have a framework for the declaration they've already made. And it would mean my son," he glanced at Eli, "has access to the person he has apparently decided is essential." June processed this carefully. "A ward," she said. "Yes. That's a formal designation." "It is. It would change everything about my position here." "Yes," he said. "It would." She looked at him. "Why?" The question was not strategic. It was honest, the kind that came from years of understanding that kindness from people with power generally had a structure to it, a weight-bearing purpose that revealed itself eventually. And it was better to find that purpose early than to be surprised by it later. Darius held her gaze. "Because my son said your name 43 times this morning before anyone could bring him to you," he said. "Because 39 wolves walked through the night on their own decision to stand in my courtyard for you. Because you took 5 blades in a corridor, and your first concern when you regained consciousness was whether the boy was frightened." He paused. "And because the packless woman who serves wine at my banquets apparently has a scent that senior wolves from 4 different bloodlines recognized as significant before I had the presence of mind to notice it myself." The last sentence landed differently than the others. June went very still. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means," Darius said, and something in his voice had changed, quieter now, more careful, The way a man spoke when he was approaching something he hadn't fully mapped yet, that my head of guard pulled me aside this morning and told me that 3 of the wolves in that courtyard said the same thing, independently, to 3 different people. He held her eyes. They said your scent carries the marker of the old bloodlines, the lines that predate the current pack system. The ones that were thought to have died out 2 generations ago. Eli stirred against her shoulder. June realized her hand had tightened slightly around him and made herself relax it. I'm packless, she said. I've always been packless. I know, Darius said. That's exactly the problem. Outside in the courtyard she heard the wolves. Not the murmur of waiting men this time. Something that had shifted in register, lower and steadier, the sound of a large number of wolves moving into a formation that meant something in a language she was only beginning to understand she had always spoken. Eli opened his eyes. He looked at June with the clear, direct gaze of a child who had slept well and woken into a world that contained the person he needed and therefore was in order. Then he looked at his father, then back at June. June, he said, with the satisfied certainty of someone confirming an arrangement. Darius looked at his son, then at June. And for the first time since she had known him, which was less than a full day but felt longer in the way that compressed time always did, the expression on his face was one she could read completely. He was not calculating. He was not performing. He was simply a man sitting across from a woman who was holding his child, in a room that smelled of cedar and healing herbs, confronting something that had walked into his castle in servant's clothes and had not, it turned out, been a servant at all. Stay, he said. It was not a command. It was not a request exactly either. It was the word of a man who had spent his entire life making decisions and had just made one that surprised him. She stayed. Not because he asked. Not because of the 39 wolves in the courtyard, or the formal designation of ward, or the old bloodline markers that 3 senior wolves had identified independently before she had even learned what they meant. She stayed because Eli had opened his eyes that morning and said her name with the quiet certainty of someone confirming that the world was still correctly arranged, and she had understood in that moment that some decisions are not really decisions at all. They are simply acknowledgments of what has already become true. The formal proceedings happened 4 days later, when she could walk without managing her breath, and the healers had cleared her for anything that didn't involve weapons or stairs taken too quickly. Marin dressed her in Vorn colors, deep gray with a narrow border of dark red at the cuffs, simple and clean, and told her with characteristic economy that she looked appropriate, which June had come to understand was Marin's version of a significant compliment. Petra helped her with her hair and did not say anything meaningful for the entire duration, which meant she was feeling a great deal. Say it, June told her. I'm not saying anything. Petra. Petra set down the comb and looked at her in the mirror with the expression of someone who had been waiting 23 years for the right moment and was now uncertain whether this was it or whether something even more significant was still coming. I always knew, she said finally, that you were not what they said you were. June looked at her reflection, the gray clothes, the healed skin above the collar where one of the wounds had left a faint mark. Her own face, which she had never considered remarkable, looking back at her from the mirror of a room in the inner castle. You couldn't have known, June said. I knew you, Petra said simply. That was enough. The courtyard ceremony was not elaborate. Darius had deliberately kept it from becoming a spectacle. No banners, no speeches, no assembled nobility performing their understanding of the moment. What it was instead was precise. June standing in the morning light, Darius to her left, Marin bearing the Vorn house seal, and the wolves who had come for her arranged in the courtyard in a formation that the old pack traditions called the witness circle. There were 44 of them by the morning of the ceremony. More had arrived in the days between. Words spreading through channels that June didn't entirely understand and had stopped trying to map. Rowan Casson was still among them, the scar on his jaw catching the light when he turned. He had not left. None of the original 39 had left. The declaration was read in the old language, which June did not speak fluently, but understood in pieces, enough to follow the shape of what was happening. Ward of the Vorn line, protected under pack law, standing recognized by the witness circle. bloodline status under investigation and formal acknowledgement pending further determination. That last part was new. Darius had told her 2 days before, in the working room with maps spread across the table, and Eli asleep in the chair by the fire, that the investigation into her bloodline had produced something that required careful handling before it was made public. He hadn't told her what, exactly. He had told her it was significant, and that she would know the full details before anyone else did, and that he was telling her this now so she could decide whether the ceremony should wait. She had told him it should not wait. He had looked at her for a moment with that careful attention, and then nodded once. When the declaration was complete, the wolves in the courtyard responded in the old way. Not with words, but with the low, resonant sound she had heard in the days before, the one that lived beneath language, and carried its meaning in frequency rather than form. It moved through the stone of the courtyard walls and up through the soles of her feet, and settled somewhere in her chest that she couldn't have pointed to on a map of the body, but recognized immediately as important. Rowan Casson stepped forward from the witness circle and inclined his head. The others followed, one by one, in the order of their arrival. The ones who had walked through the night coming first, the later arrivals behind them, each acknowledgement clean and unhurried. It took a long time. June stood in the gray morning light and received each one and did not look away from any of them. When it was finished, Darius stood beside her and said nothing. He didn't need to. The investigation into her bloodline concluded 3 weeks later. Darius told her himself, in the same working room, at the same table, with a fire in the hearth, and Eli on the floor between them arranging small carved wooden pieces into formations that only made sense to him. He spread a single document on the table and turned it so she could read it. She read it twice. The bloodline markers identified by the senior wolves in the courtyard traced directly to the Ardenvale line, one of the 3 founding bloodlines of the pack system, believed extinct since the dissolution of the original councils 2 generations prior. Not a minor old blood, not a distant connection to something significant. The root line, the source from which 8 of the current pack structures had originally branched. June was quiet for a long time after reading it. "This means," she said. "It means," Darius said carefully, "that you are not packless because you have no bloodline. You are packless because your bloodline predates the current pack designations and was never assigned to one." He paused. "In the old law, the Ardenvale line doesn't belong to any pack. It stands above the pack system. It is technically its own designation." She looked at the document, then at her hands, then at Eli, who had looked up from his wooden pieces and was watching her with the focused attention of a child who understood the emotional temperature of a room, even when he didn't understand its content. "I grew up in the servants' quarters," she said. "I know. I spent 23 years being called empty." "I know," he said, and his voice had something in it she had heard only a few times, a quietness that wasn't calm exactly, but was the product of a man exercising significant restraint over something that wanted to be louder. June set the document down. She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at Darius. "What happens now?" she said. He held her gaze. "That depends on what you want." She thought about that. The question of what she wanted had not been directed at her often enough that she had a ready answer. She examined it honestly, the way she had always examined difficult supply inventories, without wishful thinking, without avoiding the parts that were complicated. She wanted the 44 wolves in the courtyard to have a framework that honored what they had done. She wanted Eli to grow up knowing that the world contained people who would step into a corridor for him without calculation. She wanted Petra to have a room with a window that didn't let in the winter. She wanted the word empty to mean nothing anymore, not because the world had changed, but because she had moved to a place where it could not reach her. And she wanted the man sitting across from her, who had looked at her from the first moment with the attention of someone who intended to understand her completely, to keep looking. She said most of this, not all of it. The last part she kept, because some things were better allowed to move at their own pace, rather than named before they were ready. Darius listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Ardenvale designation, if formally reinstated, would make you a sovereign bloodline within the pack system. not subject to any alpha's authority. He paused, including mine. I'm aware, she said. Most people in your position would find that significant. I'm not most people, she said. And I'm not interested in sovereignty as a way to be above something. I'm interested in it as a way to stand beside something without being lesser. The fire crackled. Eli had abandoned his wooden pieces and was leaning against June's knee with the comfortable weight of a child who had decided this was where he was meant to be and saw no reason to revisit that decision. Darius looked at her for a long time. Then stand beside it, he said. The formal reinstatement of the Ardenvale bloodline took place at the Winter Assembly, 6 weeks after the heir presentation banquet that June had attended carrying a serving tray and the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent years learning to take up as little space as possible. She did not take up a small space at the Winter Assembly. She stood at the center of the great hall with Darius to her right and Rowan Cassin, who had formally pledged the Cassin line's recognition of the Ardenvale reinstatement, to her left, and the 44 wolves who had come to the courtyard arranged behind her, and she felt the weight of every eye in that room recalibrate. Lord Aldrich, who had spent the banquet season maneuvering for influence and had once referred to the East Wing's head attendant as the empty girl, stood near the back of the hall and did not speak. His expression was that of a man watching a door close on something he had not realized was valuable until the moment it was no longer available to him. June did not look at him for long. He was not the point. Petra stood near the hall's eastern pillar, in new clothes that fit properly, in a room with a window that did not let in the cold, and watched with the expression of someone who had always known and was allowing themselves, finally, to be entirely unsurprised. Eli, in the arms of his attendant near the doorway, pointed at June across the hall with the decisive authority of a child making an important identification. "June," he said clearly. Several wolves near him smiled. His attendant looked like she was trying not to. Darius, standing beside June, did not smile, but the line of his jaw shifted slightly, and she had learned by then to read what that meant. The declaration was completed. The Ardenvale line was reinstated. The witness circle acknowledged it in the old way, and the sound moved through the hall the same way it had moved through the courtyard, up through the stone floor, into the chest, settling in the place that couldn't be mapped, but could always be felt. Afterward, when the assembly had moved into the banquet and the formal proceedings had dissolved into the quieter business of wolves talking and measuring and deciding, Darius found her near the window where she had stood many times as a servant and never once as herself. He stood beside her, not across from her, looking out at the dark courtyard below where torches burned against the winter cold. "How does it feel?" he said. She considered the question properly, like something that was always true, she said, finally being said out loud. He looked at her. The firelight from the hall caught the edge of his jaw, the particular stillness of him that she had stopped finding unreadable, and had started finding instead like a language she was becoming fluent in. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the performance of a man making a declaration. Simply a choice, made with the same quiet deliberateness with which he made all his choices, certain, unhurried, and not interested in revision. June looked down at their joined hands, then up at him. Outside, 44 wolves stood in the winter night, and a small boy slept soundly in the inner chambers above them, and the Ardenvale bloodline breathed again in the world, after 2 generations of silence, and the woman who had walked into a dark corridor with a serving tray, and nothing but the decision to be in the right place became, at last, exactly where she had always been meant to stand. No one called her empty again, not ever,